The village of Marabu was a place where the earth whispered secrets to those who listened, where the rivers sang lullabies, and where the wind carried messages from the gods. It was in this village, on a night when the moon hung heavy and golden in the sky, that a prophecy was spoken. An old seer, her face lined with the weight of centuries, stood before a gathering of villagers. Her voice, cracked yet commanding, echoed in the silence. A child is born under the watchful gaze of the gods, and fate has woven a thread of danger into her life. She will fall, and death will reach for her, but destiny has chosen another path. At that moment, a wail pierced the air, the first cry of newborn Naima. The villagers gasped, their eyes darting between the old woman and the hut where the baby had just arrived. Her mother, Safia, a woman of gentle strength, held her newborn close, fear creeping into her heart. Though she did not fully understand the prophecy, she felt its weight settle upon her like a heavy stone. As Naima grew, she became the heartbeat of the village, a girl whose laughter could brighten the darkest corners. She was fearless, climbing trees that swayed under the sky's vast expanse, chasing the wind through fields of golden grass, and wading into the river's depths without hesitation. But her mother never forgot the prophecy. "Stay away from the cliffs, Naima," she would say, her voice tight with worry. "They are dangerous." Naima would smile, her dark eyes gleaming with mischief. "I am careful, Mama." But careful was never enough for fate. Safia tried to shield her daughter, keeping her close, watching her every step, warning her of the unseen dangers the world held. Yet the more she tried to contain her, the more Naima longed for freedom. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of fire, Naima stood at the edge of the village, looking out toward the cliffs her mother so often warned her about. They stood tall, unwavering, the wind howling through them like an ancient song. A strange longing stirred in her chest, as though the cliffs were calling to her. She did not know that the prophecy was already at work, that destiny was weaving its plan. She did not know that soon, the very cliffs her mother feared would become the place where fate would test her. And she did not know that somewhere in the shadows, a warrior had already been watching. The village of Marabu had long lived under the rule of the royal family, a bloodline said to be chosen by the gods themselves. Their power was absolute, their word law, and their punishment swift. The elders of the village bowed to them, not out of respect, but out of fear. And among them was Prince Jahi, the heir to the throne, the terror of the land. Jahi was a man who took what he wanted, a ruler before his time, whose hands were already stained with the suffering of those who had dared to defy him. His presence alone was enough to send villagers scrambling out of sight, his dark eyes sharp and calculating, his smile never reaching them. And now, Jahi had set his sights on Naima. He had watched her for months, entranced by her wild beauty. She was unlike the women of the palace, untamed, free, like the wind itself. She was everything he could not control, and that made him want her even more. One afternoon, when the sun burned hot against the earth, Jahi rode into Marabu on a black stallion, his royal guard following closely behind. The villagers lowered their gazes as he passed, avoiding his cruel smirk. He stopped in the center of the marketplace, where Naima stood, bartering for cloth with her mother. Naima, his voice was smooth, but the menace beneath it was unmistakable. She turned slowly, her heart pounding as she met his gaze. She had heard the stories, had seen what happened to those who dared to deny him. But she was not like the others. "Prince Jahi," she said, dipping her head only slightly, just enough to be respectful, but not enough to cower. Jahi dismounted and walked toward her, his eyes drinking her in. He reached out and took a strand of her thick, dark curls between his fingers, smirking. "You are even more beautiful up close." Naima resisted the urge to recoil, forcing herself to stay still. She could feel her mother tense beside her, gripping the cloth between her fingers like a lifeline. "I will take you as my wife," Jahi declared, loud enough for all to hear. The marketplace fell into stunned silence. Naima stiffened. "I do not wish to be your wife." Jahi chuckled, the sound low and amused, as if she had made a joke. "Your wishes are of no consequence. I have chosen you. That is all that matters." Her hands clenched at her sides. I belong to no one. The amusement in his eyes flickered into something darker. You will come to understand that all things in this kingdom belong to me, Naima. Including you. The villagers held their breath, waiting to see if she would break, if she would bow. But she did not. Jahi's smirk returned, but this time, there was a threat behind it. I will give you time to see reason, he said, stepping back. But know this, what I want, I take. And no one, not even the gods, will stop me. Then, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Naima turned to the village elders, expecting them to speak, to defend her, to challenge the prince's words. But they remained still, their faces turned away, their silence a heavy betrayal. Fear ruled them all. Her mother grabbed her wrist, her voice a whisper of terror. Naima, you must not defy him. But Naima had already made up her mind. She would never belong to Prince Jahi. No matter the cost. The sun had barely set when Naima realized she was being followed. The whispers of the wind in the trees masked the sound of approaching footsteps at first, but then she heard the unmistakable snap of a twig behind her. Her heart pounded. She turned sharply, her breath catching as she saw them, Prince Jahi's guards, emerging like shadows from the undergrowth. They had come for her. She bolted. Her bare feet barely touched the earth as she ran, dodging branches, leaping over fallen logs, her lungs burning as she pushed herself faster and faster. She knew these woods better than anyone, had spent her childhood climbing its trees, bathing in its rivers, and memorizing its hidden paths. But the guards were faster. And the prince was among them. Naima. Jahi's voice cut through the night, dark with fury and twisted amusement. You cannot run from me forever. She didn't waste her breath on a reply. Instead, she veered toward the cliffs, her only chance of escape. If she could make it to the ledge, there was a narrow pathway that led down to the river. She had climbed it many times before. It was dangerous, but not as dangerous as falling into Jahi's hands. Branches clawed at her skin as she sprinted, but she didn't slow. The guards were gaining. She could hear their heavy footsteps, the sharp clank of weapons. The prince was closer than the rest. Then, she reached the cliffs. The moon cast a pale glow over the jagged rocks below, the river a dark ribbon far beneath her. The path she needed was just ahead, but before she could move toward it, a strong hand seized her wrist. Jahi. He yanked her backward, spinning her to face him. His breath was ragged, his eyes burning with something dangerous. Enough of his foolishness, he hissed. Naima struggled, twisting against his grip, but he was stronger. You will not escape me, Naima, Jahi growled, pulling her closer. She shoved him with all her might. He staggered back just enough for her to wrench herself free. But in that split second, her foot slipped. The world tilted. She gasped as the ground vanished beneath her. And then she was falling. The wind roared in her ears, her scream swallowed by the night. The jagged rocks rushed toward her. This was it. This was how she would die. Then, something caught her. Not the ground. Not the rocks. Arms. Strong, steady arms. She barely registered what was happening before she was soaring through the air, cradled in the grip of a shadowy figure. Her breath caught as they landed softly, as if the wind itself had cushioned their fall. Her body trembled against the firm chest of the one who had saved her. A man. A warrior. His face was hidden beneath a dark mask, his eyes sharp and unreadable. His grip on her was secure, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. Naima's breath came in shaky gasps. Who are you? The warrior said nothing. Jahi's furious scream echoed from above, but the masked figure didn't flinch. Instead, he turned toward the darkness of the trees, toward safety. And then, without a word, he carried Naima away. Naima's mind spun as the masked warrior carried her through the thick forest. His movements were swift and precise, as if he knew every hidden path by heart. The cold night air bit at her skin, but the warmth of his arms kept her steady. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the pounding of her heart drowned out her voice. Who was he? Where was he taking her? And why did he save her? The prince's furious screams faded behind them, lost in the rustling leaves and chirping crickets. Only then did Naima fully realize she was free. After what felt like an eternity, the warrior slowed his pace. They had arrived at a secluded clearing, hidden deep within the forest. A small, ancient hut stood among the trees, its walls covered in climbing vines, its thatched roof blending seamlessly with the wilderness. A fire burned low outside, casting flickering shadows over the ground. Gently, the warrior lowered her to her feet. Naima stumbled slightly, but he steadied her before taking a step back. Now, standing face to face, she could study him better. He was tall, his dark skin glowing under the moonlight, his muscles taut with silent strength. The mask concealed most of his face, but his piercing eyes burned with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. She swallowed hard. Who are you? Silence. Naima took a cautious step forward. Why did you save me? Still, no answer. Frustration flared in her chest. She had almost died, she had lost everything in a single night, and this man, this stranger, refused to speak? I deserve answers, she said firmly. The prince, he would have, her voice broke for a moment, but she steadied herself. If you hadn't caught me, I would be dead. Finally, the warrior moved. Slowly, he reached up and unfastened his mask. Naima held her breath as the cloth fell away. What she saw stole the air from her lungs. He was young. Younger than she had expected. His strong jawline was marked by a faint scar, and his dark eyes held stories she could not yet understand. His expression was unreadable, but something in his gaze, something deep and ancient, made her heart race. My name is Malik, he finally said, his voice low and smooth like the whisper of the wind. Naima clung to his name, rolling it over in her mind. Malik. A stranger who had appeared from nowhere. A man who had saved her life. She took a deep breath. Why did you save me? Malik's jaw tightened. He hesitated before answering, as if weighing how much to reveal. The prophecy, he finally said. Naima's blood ran cold. The prophecy, she echoed. He nodded. Your fate was written long before tonight. You were always meant to fall, and I was always meant to catch you. Her mind reeled. She had heard the prophecy whispered throughout her childhood, spoken in hushed tones by village elders. But she had never believed in destiny, never thought it could truly dictate her life. And yet, here she was. Alive. Because of him. 1,000 questions swirled in her mind, but before she could speak, Malik's expression darkened. They will come for you, he said. The prince will not rest until he finds you. Naima's breath hitched. She knew he was right. Prince Jahi would not let this go. He would hunt her down. What do we do? She whispered. Malik met her gaze, his eyes burning with something fierce and unbreakable. We fight. Prince Jahi stood at the cliff's edge, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Below him, there was no sign of Naima's broken body on the jagged rocks. No sign of her at all. She had survived. His fingers curled into fists. The guards behind him shifted uneasily, waiting for orders, but Jahi was frozen in fury. She is gone, my prince, one of the men finally said. She must have fallen into the river. The current is too strong, she could not have lived. But Jahi was not convinced. He knew Naima. She was stubborn. She was resilient. And the way she had disappeared so suddenly, it did not feel like death. Someone had taken her. His jaw clenched as he turned to face his men. Search the forest. Find her. His voice was a blade, cutting through the silence. And if she is alive, bring her to me. The guards hesitated. They knew what it meant to defy Jahi, but they also feared the deep forest at night. The villagers spoke of spirits lurking in the shadows, of warriors long forgotten who still watched over the land. But they dared not question him. "Yes, my prince," they answered in unison before dispersing into the trees. Jahi's lips curled into a dark smile as he gazed at the moonlit forest. She thought she had escaped. But he would find her. And when he did, she would regret ever running from him. Naima's heart pounded as she sat beside the fire, staring into the flickering flames. Malik sat across from her, sharpening a long blade with slow, deliberate strokes. The tension in the air was thick, laced with unspoken questions. She finally broke the silence. "Why did you say you were meant to catch me?" Malik's hands stilled for a moment before he set the blade down. "Because I have been watching you for a long time." A chill ran through her. "Watching me?" He nodded. "You don't remember, do you?" Naima frowned. "Remember what?" Malik exhaled, looking into the fire as if it held the answer. "Years ago, when we were children, you saved my life." Her breath caught in her throat. "What?" "You don't remember," he said again, more to himself than to her. He leaned back, staring at her with those piercing eyes. "You were no older than 10. I was just a boy, lost in these same woods. The village had cast me out, said I was cursed. I had no food, no shelter. I would have died if you hadn't found me." Naima's mind whirled, trying to grasp the memory. A boy in the woods, starving, weak. She remembered offering food, remembered sneaking bread from her mother's basket to give to someone. A boy with dark eyes. Her breath hitched. "It was you." Malik nodded. "You saved me that day." His voice softened. "And now, I have saved you." A lump formed in Naima's throat. Fate. It all came back to fate. She didn't know what to say, so she whispered the only thing that came to her mind. "What happens now?" Malik's expression hardened. "The prince won't stop hunting you." Naima shivered at the thought. Jahi's obsession with her was not love, it was control. He would never allow her to be free. Malik reached for his blade again. "I will protect you, Naima." She met his gaze, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. There was none. He meant it. And somehow, she believed him. But deep in the shadows of the forest, Jahi's men were already closing in. And time was running out. The forest was no longer a place of refuge, it had become a battlefield waiting to erupt. The rustling leaves and distant hoots of night creatures masked the true danger that lurked in the darkness. Jahi's men were searching, their torches flickering between the trees, their hushed voices filled with urgency. Naima gripped the edge of the wooden bench outside Malik's small hut, her pulse pounding in her ears. "They're coming, aren't they?" she whispered. Malik stood near the entrance, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "Yes." His voice was calm, but Naima sensed the tension in his stance. A deep breath rattled in her chest. "What do we do?" Malik turned toward her, his dark eyes glinting under the dim firelight. "We don't wait for them to find us." Naima's heart skipped a beat. "You mean, we leave?" No. Malik stepped closer, his gaze locked on hers. "We fight." The word sent a shiver down her spine. Fight. All her life, she had been running, from fate, from Jahi, from the power others held over her. But now, standing here in the quiet of the forest with Malik's unwavering presence beside her, something shifted inside her. For the first time, she didn't want to run. "Will you trust me?" Malik asked. Naima looked at him, at the man who had saved her from certain death, the boy she had unknowingly saved years ago. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. Malik nodded. "Then listen carefully." He grabbed a small pouch from the wooden table inside the hut, handing it to her. She peered inside, dried herbs, dark powders, a small curved dagger. "If they find you before I do, use this," he instructed. "The powder will blind them. The herbs will mask your scent if you need to hide. And the dagger," he paused, his voice lowering. "Use it only if you must." Naima swallowed hard. She had never held a weapon before, never even thought about harming another person. But if it came down to Jahi or her. She gripped the pouch tighter. I understand. Malik gave a small nod of approval before strapping his blade across his back. Stay close to me. No matter what happens, don't hesitate. A howl echoed through the forest. The sound wasn't from a wild animal. It was a signal. Jahi's men had picked up their trail. Malik's jaw tightened. It's time. Naima's hands trembled slightly, but she clenched her fists, willing the fear away. She had spent her whole life being afraid. That ended tonight. With one final glance at Malik, she followed him into the shadows, disappearing into the depths of the forest. The hunt had begun. The night air was thick with tension, the forest alive with the distant murmurs of Jahi's men. Naima's heart pounded as she moved silently beside Malik, each step calculated, each breath measured. The darkness was their ally, but for how long? Malik led her through a narrow path, overgrown with vines and twisted roots. He moved like a shadow, silent and deadly. Naima tried to match his pace, but her nerves made her steps unsteady. A flicker of torchlight ahead made them freeze. Voices drifted through the trees. She can't have gone far, a guard muttered. Prince Jahi said to bring her back alive. And the man, another asked. The first guard scoffed. Kill him. Naima felt Malik tense beside her. His grip on the hilt of his sword tightened. He turned to her, voice barely above a whisper. Stay hidden. No matter what happens, do not come out. Naima wanted to argue, but the sharpness in his gaze silenced her. She nodded, pressing herself against the trunk of a thick tree, pulling the small pouch he had given her close. Malik stepped forward, disappearing into the darkness. Moments stretched into eternity. The rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, it all became deafening. Then, the clash of metal rang out. Naima's breath caught in her throat. The fight had begun. She risked a peek from behind the tree. Malik moved like a storm, his sword a flash of silver under the moonlight. One guard lunged, but Malik sidestepped, striking with swift precision. The man crumpled. Another attacked from behind. Malik spun, blocking the blow, his movements fluid like water. The guard barely had time to react before Malik's blade cut through the air. But there were too many. Naima clenched the pouch in her hands, her mind racing. She couldn't just stand here. Malik had told her to stay hidden. But if she did, he would die. Her fingers found the small clay vial inside the pouch. The blinding powder. Before fear could stop her, she moved. With a deep breath, she stepped into the clearing and flung the powder toward the nearest guard. A cloud of fine dust exploded into the air. The man staggered back, clutching his eyes, screaming. Malik seized the moment, striking down another attacker. Naima's presence did not go unnoticed. A guard lunged at her. She barely had time to react before Malik's dagger flew past her, embedding itself in the man's shoulder. Run! Malik ordered. But Naima wasn't running. She grabbed a handful of the herbs, crushing them between her fingers, and threw them onto the flames of a nearby torch. Thick smoke erupted, covering them in a dark haze. Malik took her hand. Now we run. Together, they disappeared into the night, leaving Jahi's men choking in the smoke. But they were not safe yet. Jahi would not stop. And the real battle was only beginning. Jahi stood at the edge of the smoldering battlefield, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The scent of burnt herbs and charred wood lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of his humiliation. His men, coughing and rubbing their stinging eyes, had failed him. Again. He turned his piercing gaze to the trembling guard before him, the man's face still streaked with soot. You let them escape? His voice was calm, too calm. The guard swallowed hard. My prince, they used trickery. Smoke, powder, we couldn't see. Jahi's hand shot out, gripping the man's throat. With frightening ease, he lifted him off the ground. I did not ask for excuses, he hissed. I asked why the girl is still breathing. The other guards stood frozen, watching their prince in silence. They had seen his wrath before, and they knew better than to interfere. With a flick of his wrist, Jahi released the guard, sending him crashing to the ground. He gasped for air, but Jahi had already turned away. His gaze shifted to the forest, where the shadows had swallowed Naima and her mysterious protector. His blood boiled. He had never been denied anything in his life. No one had dared defy him until her. But Naima would learn. No one ran from Prince Jahi and lived to tell the tale. He raised his hand, signaling his men. Gather the hunters. Send word to every outpost. The girl and her warrior are to be found. His voice darkened. And this time, I want her alive. A cruel smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. She thought she could escape him? She had only delayed the inevitable. A desperate escape, 800 words. Naima's legs burned as she ran, her lungs aching with every breath. The thick undergrowth of the forest clawed at her skin, but she pushed forward, Malik's hand firm around hers, guiding her through the darkness. They could still hear the distant shouts of Jahi's men. They had escaped, but not for long. Malik suddenly pulled her to a stop, his grip tightening. Listen. Naima strained her ears. At first, there was only silence, then, a faint rustling. Not from the trees. Something else. She turned to Malik. They're close. He nodded, his expression unreadable. We need to split up. Naima's stomach twisted. No. We stay together. It's the only way. His voice was firm but gentle. If they catch us now, there will be no second escape. Panic surged through her. But I don't know where to go. Malik took her hand, pressing a small object into her palm. A carved wooden pendant, smooth and cool against her skin. Follow the river north. Look for the ruins by dawn. I will find you there. Naima hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse. To stay. But there was no time. She nodded. Be careful. Malik's lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but instead, he gave her a brief, searching look before stepping back into the shadows. And then he was gone. Naima clenched the pendant and turned toward the river, forcing herself forward, even as fear gnawed at her heart. Somewhere behind her, the hunt continued. And the night was far from over. Naima ran. The cold night air burned her throat, but she couldn't stop. Every sound, the rustling leaves, the snapping of twigs, felt like a shadow creeping closer, like Jahi's men breathing down her neck. The river's soft murmuring grew louder, guiding her north as Malik had told her. She gripped the wooden pendant in her hand, willing herself to be brave. But fear clung to her like a second skin. Then, she heard it. Footsteps. They were behind her, fast, relentless. Panic surged through her veins. She forced herself forward, her feet pounding against the damp earth. The trees thinned, revealing the river ahead, its silver surface shimmering under the moonlight. She didn't slow down. She couldn't. A sharp whistle cut through the night air. A signal. Naima barely had time to react before a figure lunged from the shadows. Strong arms wrapped around her, yanking her backward. She twisted, struggling, but her captor was too powerful. I have her, a voice barked. Naima's heart plummeted. No. She thrashed wildly, kicking and clawing, but the man's grip was iron. He dragged her toward the trees, away from the river, away from her only chance of escape. She's more trouble than she's worth, another guard sneered, stepping into the moonlight. The prince should have just killed her. Jahi wants her alive, the first guard growled. Doesn't mean she has to be unharmed. Naima's blood ran cold. She had to act now. With all her strength, she stomped down on her captor's foot, hard. The man cursed, loosening his grip just enough for her to twist free. She spun, ramming her elbow into his ribs before bolting toward the river. Shouts erupted behind her. Then, a sudden whistle. Not from Jahi's men. From the trees. Naima barely had time to react before an arrow sliced through the air, striking the guard closest to her. The man dropped with a strangled cry. Chaos erupted. Figures emerged from the darkness, moving like ghosts through the trees. Arrows flew, cutting through the night like silent daggers. Jahi's men barely had time to draw their weapons before they were overwhelmed. Naima stumbled back, breathless. And then, she saw him. Malik. His sword flashed in the moonlight as he cut through the last of the guards with effortless precision. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter, he was a warrior in every sense of the word. As the last man fell, silence settled over the clearing. The attackers, Malik's allies, melted back into the forest, disappearing like spirits. Malik turned to her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Are you hurt?" Naima shook her head, still too stunned to speak. His gaze softened, but only for a moment. "We need to keep moving. Jahi won't stop until he has you." Naima swallowed hard, gripping the pendant in her hand. Jahi wanted her alive. But if he caught her again? She wasn't sure she would stay that way. Naima followed Malik through the dense forest, her breath still ragged from the chase. The adrenaline was wearing off, but fear still coiled in her stomach. She cast a glance behind her, half expecting Jahi's men to rise from the shadows like vengeful spirits. "They won't follow us for now," Malik said without looking back. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, tension, urgency. "But we need to reach the ruins before dawn." Naima gripped the pendant in her palm. "Who were those men that helped us?" Malik was silent for a long moment before he finally answered. "They are part of something bigger. A group that has been waiting for the right moment to rise against Jahi and his rule." Naima frowned. "You mean rebels?" Malik let out a quiet breath, his jaw tightening. "To some, yes. But to those who have suffered under Jahi's family, we are the only hope left." Naima felt a chill creep down her spine. "You're fighting against the prince?" Malik stopped walking and turned to face her fully. In the moonlight, his dark eyes burned with something fierce, something she couldn't yet understand. "I am fighting for justice," he said. "For people like you." Naima's throat tightened. People like her. Women forced to bow to Jahi's whims. Villagers silenced by fear. She had spent so long trying to escape him, but what if running wasn't enough? Before she could say anything, Malik placed a hand on her arm. "We need to keep moving." She nodded and followed, though her mind was still spinning. Hours later, the forest began to thin, giving way to broken stone structures hidden beneath vines and moss. The ruins. Malik led her through the crumbling walls, his movements careful, practiced. It was clear he had been here before. "We'll rest here for a while," he said, gesturing toward an alcove beneath an ancient archway. "It's safe." Naima sank onto the cool stone, exhaustion pressing down on her. Malik sat across from her, sharpening his blade with slow, precise movements. The silence stretched between them before she finally spoke. "Who are you, really?" Malik's hand stilled. His gaze lifted to hers, unreadable. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "You saved me. Twice. You fight against the prince. You move like a warrior. But you're more than just a rebel, aren't you?" His expression darkened slightly, as if she had touched upon a truth he wasn't ready to reveal. Then, finally, he spoke. "I was once part of Jahi's world." Naima's breath caught. "I was raised in the palace," he continued. "Trained to be a warrior under the very man I now fight against." His fingers tightened around his blade. "But I saw the truth. The corruption. The cruelty. So I left." Naima stared at him, her heart pounding. Malik had once stood beside the monster who hunted her. And now he was her only protector. The night was eerily silent as Naima and Malik remained hidden within the ruins. The cool air carried the distant sounds of the jungle, chirping insects, rustling leaves, but beneath it all, there was an unnatural stillness. A storm was coming, not of nature, but of blood and steel. Malik sat by the crumbling stone wall, his sword resting across his lap, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the trees. Naima could see the tension in his posture. He was listening, waiting. Then, a distant horn echoed through the night. Naima's heart jumped. What was that? Malik's grip on his sword tightened. Jahi. Before she could speak, he was already moving. He pulled Naima up by the wrist, his expression hard. They found us. Torches flickered in the distance, a sea of orange flames weaving through the trees. The prince had brought his army. Naima's breath quickened. We can't fight them all. Malik turned to her, his dark eyes steady. We're not going to. He led her deeper into the ruins, his movements swift but controlled. He knew these ancient walls well, knew the hidden paths that wove through them. Behind them, voices carried through the night. Find them. They must be here. Jahi's men spread through the ruins like hungry wolves, their torches casting long, eerie shadows. Naima pressed herself against the cool stone, her heart pounding in her chest. Malik's hand touched her arm, his voice low. Stay close. They moved in silence, stepping carefully over broken stone and tangled roots. But just as they reached an opening in the ruins, a soldier's voice rang out. There! The girl! Naima barely had time to react before an arrow shot past her, embedding itself in the stone inches from her head. Malik cursed under his breath, shoving her behind him. In a blur of motion, he drew his sword. Run, Naima! Now! But she didn't. She couldn't. She wasn't going to abandon him. The soldiers rushed forward, their weapons gleaming in the firelight. Malik met them head-on, his sword flashing through the air. The first man fell instantly, blood spraying onto the stones. Another lunged, but Malik twisted, driving his blade deep into his attacker's chest. Naima turned to flee, but more soldiers appeared, cutting off her escape. Then, a figure stepped through the firelight. Jahi. His fine robes billowed in the wind, his dark eyes gleaming with triumph. Going somewhere, my love? Naima's blood ran cold. Malik moved to stand between them, his blade dripping with blood. You'll have to kill me first. Jahi smirked, drawing his own sword. That was always the plan. The prince lunged. Their blades met in a clash of steel, sparks flying as the two warriors battled. Malik was fast, precise, his movements like a shadow dancing through the firelight. But Jahi was ruthless, his strikes powerful and unrelenting. Naima watched in horror, knowing this was a fight to the death. And only one of them would walk away. The clash of steel rang through the ruins as Malik and Jahi battled beneath the flickering torchlight. Their blades met with deadly precision, each strike fueled by years of training and unspoken rage. Naima's breath hitched as she watched, her heart slamming against her ribs. Malik was fast, his movements fluid like water, but Jahi was relentless. Every strike, every lunge carried the brute force of a man who had never known fear. You should have stayed hidden, traitor, Jahi sneered, swinging his sword in a vicious arc. Malik barely ducked in time, the blade slicing the air just above his head. I don't hide from cowards, Malik growled, countering with a sharp thrust. Jahi twisted away, his eyes burning with fury. And yet, you steal what belongs to me. His gaze flickered to Naima, making her stomach turn with fear and disgust. She was never yours, Malik spat, his voice sharp as his blade. Jahi roared, charging forward with renewed rage. Their swords clashed once more, but this time, Malik saw his opening. A swift sidestep. A perfectly timed parry. And then, Malik's sword found its mark. Jahi staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief. Blood bloomed across his chest, staining his fine robes. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came, only a gurgled breath before his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the stone floor, his sword slipping from his grasp. The firelight cast eerie shadows across his fallen form, the once mighty prince now nothing more than a broken man. Silence. The soldiers, seeing their leader slain, hesitated. Then, one by one, they turned and fled into the darkness, their loyalty vanishing like smoke. Naima let out a shaky breath, her knees threatening to give way. Malik stood over Jahi's body, his grip on his sword tightening for a moment before he slowly exhaled. He turned to Naima, his dark eyes searching hers. "It's over," he said. Naima took a trembling step forward. "Is it?" Malik hesitated before nodding. For him, yes. The weight of everything crashed over her at once, her escape, the chase, the battle, the prophecy that had led her here. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Malik extended his hand. "Come. There's one last thing we must do." Naima didn't need to ask. She already knew. It was time to return home. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon as Naima and Malik stepped into the village. The once familiar paths felt different, as though they carried the weight of the past and the promise of a new future. The villagers gathered in hushed whispers, their eyes widening as they saw the two figures approaching. Then, gasps filled the air. "The prince is dead," someone murmured. "They have returned," another voice cried. Naima's mother, weak from sleepless nights of worry, pushed through the crowd. When her eyes fell on her daughter, tears streamed down her cheeks. "Naima." She ran forward, pulling Naima into her arms, sobbing into her hair. Naima clung to her, feeling the warmth of home once more. "I'm here, Mama. I'm safe." Malik stood beside them, silent but watchful. The village elders approached him, their expressions unreadable. "You were the masked warrior all along," the eldest among them said. His gaze swept over Malik's battle-worn form. "And you have slain the tyrant." Malik met their eyes with quiet resolve. "I did what had to be done." There was silence before an elder spoke. "You have freed us from his cruelty." He turned to the gathered villagers and raised his voice. "Let it be known, Prince Jahi is no more. His reign of terror ends today." A wave of relief and joy swept through the crowd. Cheers erupted, voices rising in celebration. Malik, the warrior once cast out, had become their hero. Naima turned to him, her heart full. "You changed everything." Malik shook his head. "It was you, Naima. It was always you." She smiled, knowing deep within that fate had led them here. The prophecy had spoken of a deadly fall, but not of doom. It had been a fall into destiny, into the arms of the man who would save her, not just from death, but from a life she never chose. As the sun rose higher, bathing the village in golden light, Naima knew this was just the beginning. A new dawn had come, not just for her, but for all of them. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next.